Welcome. You're listening to Weekend from the BBC World Service with me, Celia Hatton. My two guests this morning are Giles Fraser, priest in charge at St Mary's Newington in South London, and the former Canon Chancellor of St Paul's Cathedral. He's also a columnist for unheard.com. I'm also joined by Milica Pesic, Executive Director of the Media Diversity Institute in London, and I'll be asking them on their thoughts and opinions on a variety of stories coming up. First, we're going to turn to a difficult story for some to discuss, but it's one that's getting attention worldwide since the events in the Canadian city, my city, of Toronto earlier this week, when Alec Missanian drove a van into pedestrians, killing 10 people in Toronto. The initial suspicion was that he could be linked to terrorism, but shortly after the attack, a Facebook post by Manassian, which has since been authenticated, suggested the young man identified as an INCEL. That term stands for involuntary celibacy, meaning men who fail to have physical relationships with women. Those men foster angry, sometimes violent feelings towards those men who do. The New York-based writer Aditi Natasha Kini has been investigating INCEL groups on the internet, and she first told me why she became interested in finding out about these groups.
It's kind of a funny story. A few years ago, I came into brief contact with someone who tried to neg me. Negging is when you compliment someone and say something negative about them at the same time, and it's a pickup artist technique. When I asked a friend about it, she told me about this whole men's rights activist world out there, especially on websites like Reddit and 4chan, which are forums for people to have conversations in about topics. And I found the Red Pill, which is a pickup artist community. And from there, I just learned more and more about the different groups that are men's rights activists that appear in different forms.
So yes, but there's a pretty big difference, isn't there, between pickup artists and the extreme group who would call themselves incels. Is that right?
They're not all extremists. There are, and just as in any group, there's the people who act on the things they say, and there's the people in the middle who came in with genuine problems and feelings of discontentment and disenfranchised and stuff like that. So the Red Pill is a much larger group. On Reddit itself, it has 250,000 people, and all of these other kinds of groups are basically different forms of misogyny.
I'd like to paraphrase the Facebook post that was written by the person who was arrested in Toronto. He says, "Private Manassian wishing to speak to Sergeant 4chan. The incel rebellion has already begun. We will overthrow the Chads and Stacys. All hail to the Supreme Gentleman, Elliot Rodger." Can you interpret this for us?
So Elliot Rodger, I think he killed around 6 people in 2014 and injured a few more. He was a very young man who opened fire on people, and he was recorded. He published a bunch of misogynist rants. He identified as involuntary celibate. They call incel communities. A lot of people often call him Saint Elliot Rodger, and talk about the day he shot up those people as like a day of celebration. And this incel uprising or rebellion has been mentioned more since Manassian's attack, because there's a sort of like anger that the world is like, there's like the mainstream world that has sex is not including them. Chads are muscular, attractive men, people who are like men who are just naturally attractive, and Stacys will only have sex with a Chad and will not touch an incel.
So at the heart of this really is just the feeling of total rejection by some people in the mainstream or some women in the mainstream who, is it just fair to say that most incels simply think they're too unattractive to be able to have sex and to have love?
Yes, I think that's the basis of their philosophy and ideology. It's very interesting because when women are told they're ugly repeatedly throughout our entire lives, it's very internalized. Like there's not this sort of like organizing around it. But it's interesting to see how sexual entitlement and toxic masculinity can like create these communities.
You know, it's an interesting contrast, isn't it? On the one hand, we have young men writing online saying that they feel unattractive, they can't get a date, they can't have sex, and voicing that frustration. But at the extreme end of it, we have men, advocating extreme violence and killing. How do those two things go together?
I think they go together because the foundation of all those complaints is a fundamental inability to understand women's agency. There is the people complaining that they don't get sex view women as objects to have sex with who should be sexually available. And when you have these voices in your head and you start off with this initial complaint, and then you hear the more radical extremist voices saying that women deserve to die, people deserve to die because because they get to be mainstream and we get to live like this, it can push someone to the extreme.
The growth of the incel movement has been linked to the rise of the alt-right. Have you seen parallels in these two worlds?
Absolutely. A bunch of men's rights activist subreddits seem to have burgeoned after 2013. The incel subreddit itself exploded in July of 2016 as a website that does growth analysis showed me when I was writing the Vice article. And I did see that the increase was it was parallel to Trump's nomination. It was parallel to a bunch of other things going on in the world's in the sort of sweeping rise of xenophobia, racism, and supremacy. And it's a sort of bald-faced, unapologetic, we're here, we don't like you sort of stance. And the growth is very much linked to this.
What was it like to research this world? How did it make you feel to read some of those posts on Reddit?
Weirdly enough, it gave me more insight into the sort of uncertainty and fear that I had when I would see one-off posts. You would sometimes they'd surface on Twitter, on Reddit, but I would often wonder about the mindset of someone who would say these things. Going deeper into the research and spending quite a bit of time in these communities as a silent observer, it gave me some idea of how one can move from my life sucks, I don't have sex, to my life sucks, I want everyone else to also die. That's the sort of thing that it gave me more insight into. Writing the article was an experience that I did not necessarily expect to have. I was doxxed and harassed, and I felt very unsafe. That's why they did it, because you intimidate people, and then they stop talking about you, and then you get to continue doing this without any censure, without any investigation.
That was the writer Aditi Natasha Kini speaking to me from New York about the INCEL movement. Melissa Passage, I want to ask you first, because this has direct ties with the work that you do at the Media Diversity Institute. How should we deal, do you think, with forums that fuel the radicalization of young men?
Well, my whole heart is saying ignore them because we are giving them a platform. They are now on BBC. Everyone is talking about them, but obviously they are there, and there should be some kind, as Giles would say, some kind of dialogue about how you talk to people who are so radicalized. And for me, more important, I think, is why we are shifting towards talking about incel when there is a Toronto incident when there were people killed, and they were killed by someone who hates the whole group, in this case women. And what upsets me in particular, if the killer had a Muslim name, we would immediately start using the term terrorism. He's not a Muslim, and what he did is based on hatred of women, on misogyny. Why we are not calling it terrorism? Is it because it's not ethnicity and religion involved? So it's violence, hatred, and it should be called that way.
So, Giles, do we use the same techniques to address this group, the same techniques that we'd use to address another group of terrorists?
I think the first thing is to try and understand it a little bit. I mean, I think there's always been men who've been angry at women beautiful women because of the power that they had over them. This sort of misogyny, there's a form of misogyny that starts there. But there's something, I think, particular about the sort of 4chan type of mentality. And there's a cognitive dissonance here at the heart of it. On the one hand, they think they're superior. They're masters of the universe. They're sort of ubermensch, powerful, nerdy, powerful people. And on the other hand, no one wants to sleep with them. And they have this, doesn't compute. How can I be so superior? And yet nobody wants me. And it forms this cognitive dissonance, erupts in a form of violence. And I think there's something very interesting here about the way this sort of entitlement, this sense of superiority that exists in these alt-right channels. And that actually when it meets reality, it's exposed as being actually just a little bit pathetic. And people can't cope with that.
I think they don't hate only beautiful women. They hate all women, particularly because they want to reduce us, to turn us back to where they think women belong, being reduced to being mothers, being submissive wives. So it's a hatred towards all women and should be called that name.
All right. Well, it's 43 minutes past the hour. You're listening to Weekend on the BBC World Service. I'm Celia Hatton.